It is the 31st of May, 1940, and Private Albert Tennant stands chest-deep in the cold waters of the English Channel. Behind him, the French port of Dunkirk burns. Black smoke rises from shattered oil tanks, blotting out the morning sun. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, lies England. Home. Safety. But between Tennant and salvation stretches a queue of exhausted men that seems to have no end. German Stukas circle overhead like vultures, their sirens screaming as they dive. In the past 5 days, nearly 200,000 soldiers have escaped this beach. Today, 68,000 more will follow. But Tennant does not know this. He knows only that he has been standing in this water for 6 hours, and the tide is rising. 3 weeks ago, the British Expeditionary Force was the pride of the Empire. Now it clings to a strip of sand, waiting to be saved or slaughtered. The road to this moment began with a gamble that no one believed would succeed. For 8 months, Europe had held its breath. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war but did little to prosecute it. Soldiers called it the Phony War, the Sitzkrieg, the Boer War. The British Expeditionary Force, some 300,000 strong, dug trenches along the Belgian frontier and waited for an attack that never came. By the spring of 1940, some wondered if Hitler might simply leave the Western powers alone. General John Vereker, 6th Viscount Gort, commanded the BEF. A decorated veteran of the Great War who had earned the Victoria Cross for extraordinary valor, Gort was a soldier, brave to the point of recklessness, and devoted to his men. But he was also a man bred for a different kind of war. His experience lay in the trenches, in set-piece battles where courage and endurance mattered more than speed. The war that was about to engulf him would be nothing like the one he had trained for. On the morning of the 10th of May 1940, the waiting ended. Germany launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Paratroopers dropped into the Netherlands. Gliders landed atop the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael, neutralizing its guns within hours. German Army Group B under General Fedor von Bock surged into Belgium, and the Allies responded exactly as German planners had anticipated. The French and British high commands had spent years preparing for this moment. Their plan, known as the Dial Plan, called for the best Allied divisions to advance into Belgium the moment Germany attacked. They would meet the enemy along the River Dial and fight a defensive battle on Belgian soil, keeping the war away from France. It was a sound strategy for the war they expected. But the Germans were not fighting that war. While the Allies rushed north into Belgium, 3 German Panzer Corps under Generals Heinz Guderian, Georg Hans Reinhardt, and Hermann Hoth executed the true stroke. They drove through the Ardennes forest, a region of wooded hills and narrow roads that French strategists had dismissed as impassable for armored forces. Marshal Philippe Pétain himself had called it impenetrable. The Germans proved him catastrophically wrong. By the 12th of May, German tanks had crossed the Franco-Belgian frontier and stood overlooking the Meuse River. French defenders, mostly second-rate divisions holding what was considered a quiet sector, crumbled under the assault. Stukas dove on their positions with sirens wailing, a psychological weapon as devastating as any bomb. Infantry crossed the Meuse in rubber boats while engineers threw pontoon bridges across the water. By the 15th of May, the panzers were loose in open country, racing for the English Channel. The speed of the German advance defied comprehension. Guderian's tanks covered 40 miles in a single day. French commanders, accustomed to the methodical pace of the previous war, could not process information fast enough to respond. Orders arrived for positions that had already fallen. Reinforcements marched toward battles that were already lost. The Allied front did not break so much as it dissolved. On the 17th of May, Prime Minister Winston Churchill flew to Paris. He had been in office for only a week, having replaced Neville Chamberlain as Britain's leader on the same day the German offensive began. At the French headquarters, Churchill asked General Maurice Gamelin, the supreme Allied commander, where the strategic reserve was positioned to counterattack the German breakthrough. Gamelin's answer stunned him. "There is none," the general replied. Churchill later wrote that he was dumbfounded. The French had committed everything to the front lines. Nothing remained to plug the gap. 2 days later, Lord Gort met with General Gaston Bellot, commander of the French First Army and coordinator of Allied forces in the north. The meeting took place in the Belgian town of Ypres, sacred ground where hundreds of thousands had died in the trenches a generation before. Bellot delivered news that made those old battlefields seem almost peaceful by comparison. The French had no troops between the German panzers and the sea. The Allied armies in Belgium, more than 1 million men, were about to be cut off. Gort immediately understood what this meant. He began planning a retreat to the coast. Dunkirk, a small French port near the Belgian border, offered the only hope. It had adequate harbor facilities, it was surrounded by marshes that might slow German armor, and it possessed the longest uninterrupted beach in Europe. If the BEF could reach Dunkirk, there was a chance, however slim, that the Royal Navy might evacuate some portion of the army before the Germans closed the trap. On the 20th of May, German tanks reached the channel at Abbeville. The Allied armies in Belgium were now completely surrounded. To the east, Army Group B pressed forward. To the west and south, Army Group A and its panzers blocked any escape. The British and French had walked into a trap of historic proportions, and the jaws were closing fast. The next day brought a flicker of hope. At Arras, British tanks counterattacked the German flank. The assault was small, just 2 tank battalions and 2 infantry battalions, but it achieved local success before being driven back. More importantly, it alarmed the German high command. Memories of 1914, when a French counterattack at the Marne had stopped the German advance on Paris, haunted their planning. If the Allies could strike once, they might strike again, harder. Gort now faced an impossible choice. London and the French command demanded that he attack southward, linking up with French forces below the German corridor. But Gort could see what his superiors could not. The French were in no condition to counterattack. Any move south would expose the BEF to destruction. His duty to his army warred with his duty to obey orders. He chose his army. By the 25th of May, Gort had committed the divisions meant for the southern attack to a different purpose. They would cover the retreat to Dunkirk. This decision, made against explicit orders from both London and Paris, would save the British Expeditionary Force. It might also have cost Gort his career had events unfolded differently. As one historian later observed, Gort was the man who, by forfeiting Britain's only land force, could easily have lost the war in a week of afternoons. Instead, he saved it. At Dover Castle, in tunnels carved into the famous White Cliffs, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay gathered his staff. Ramsay was 57 years old, recalled from retirement at Churchill's personal request. He was meticulous, tireless, and possessed a quality rare in senior officers. He trusted his subordinates. On the 20th of May, before London had even authorized an evacuation, Ramsay began planning one. The operation would be called Dynamo, named for the electrical generator housed in the room next to his command post. The initial estimates were grim. The War Office believed they might save 45,000 men over 2 days, at which point the Germans would surely overrun the perimeter. Even Churchill, rallying the nation with his rhetoric, privately expected to rescue only 20 or 30,000. The bulk of the British Expeditionary Force, along with their French and Belgian allies, would be killed or captured. It would be the greatest military disaster in British history. Then Hitler made his decision. On the 24th of May, the Führer visited General Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters at Charleville. The panzers had advanced so rapidly that their commanders were growing nervous. Tank losses were mounting. The terrain around Dunkirk was marshy, poor country for armor. And that British counterattack at Arras had reminded everyone that the enemy could still bite. Rundstedt recommended a pause. Hitler, who had served in Flanders during the Great War and remembered its sucking mud, agreed. He issued what would become known as the Halt Order. Guderian's tanks sat idle just 15 miles from Dunkirk. From a nearby hill, the general could see the town walls. His men had thrown bridges across the last canal. Victory was within reach. And then the order came. Stop. Wait. The Luftwaffe would handle the rest. For 48 hours, the German panzers remained frozen in place, while the British and French frantically strengthened their defenses. It was time they should never have been given, time that would change everything. At 6:57 on the evening of the 26th of May, the Admiralty issued the order. Operation Dynamo was to commence immediately. In Dover, Admiral Ramsay had been awake for nearly 40 hours. His staff officers moved through the tunnels beneath the castle like ghosts, their faces pale in the electric light, coordinating a fleet that grew larger by the hour. Destroyers, minesweepers, channel ferries, hospital ships, anything that could float and carry men. The initial plan called for lifting 10,000 soldiers per day from each of 3 ports. But Boulogne had already fallen. Calais was surrounded and would surrender within hours. Only Dunkirk remained. Captain William Tennant volunteered for the most dangerous assignment. Ramsay needed a senior officer on the ground at Dunkirk to coordinate the evacuation, someone with the authority to make decisions and the courage to make them under fire. Tennant, the chief staff officer to the First Sea Lord, stepped forward without hesitation. On the afternoon of the 27th of May, he boarded the destroyer HMS Wolfhound with 12 officers and 160 sailors. Every 30 minutes during the crossing, German bombers found them. The Wolfhound's gunners blazed away at diving Stukas while Tennant watched and understood. If the crossing was this dangerous, the evacuation would be a nightmare. He arrived at Dunkirk just after 6 in the evening. What he found erased any hope of an orderly operation. The town was destroyed. German bombs had shattered every window, collapsed entire blocks, and set the oil storage tanks ablaze. Fires raged, unchecked because the water mains had burst. Bodies lay in the streets, soldiers and civilians alike, unburied and already beginning to bloat in the spring warmth. The sight of Dunkirk gave one a rather hollow feeling in the pit of the stomach, Tennant later recalled. There was not a pane of glass left anywhere. The harbor was useless. Luftwaffe raids had wrecked the quays and sunk vessels in the shipping channels. Large ships could not approach. Tennant's heart sank as he surveyed the damage. The entire evacuation plan had assumed a functioning port. Without one, how could they possibly move hundreds of thousands of men? He walked the beaches east of town, his sailors fanning out to establish order among the growing crowds of soldiers. The sand stretched for miles, gently sloping into the sea. It was perfect terrain for assembling large numbers of troops. It was also perfectly exposed to air attack, and the gradual slope meant that the water remained shallow far from shore. Destroyers could not get within a mile of the beach. Even smaller vessels would struggle. Soldiers would have to wade out chest deep, then climb into boats one by one. At that rate, the evacuation would take weeks. They had days at most. Meanwhile, across the channel, an extraordinary mobilization was underway. On the 14th of May, nearly 2 weeks before Dynamo began, the Admiralty had broadcast an unusual order. All owners of self-propelled pleasure craft between 30 and 100 feet in length were to register their vessels within 14 days. No one quite knew who had issued this order or why, but lists had been compiled. Now those lists became invaluable. Officers from the small vessels pool fanned out across southern England, commandeering boats from boatyards, marinas, and private docks, Thames river launches, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, sailing barges, lifeboats from coastal stations, even fireboats from the London Fire Brigade. Some owners were not even informed. They would return to find their vessels gone, requisitioned by the Crown. Others insisted on coming along. Charles Lightoller, the 66-year-old former second officer of the Titanic, refused to let anyone else take his motor yacht Sundowner. If she was going to Dunkirk, he would be at the helm. His son Roger and a young sea scout named Gerald Ashcroft would crew her. The man who had survived the most famous shipwreck in history was sailing toward the greatest evacuation in history. Back at Dunkirk, Tennant made the decision that would save the army. The harbor was destroyed, but its outer structures remained intact. Two long breakwaters, called moles, extended from the harbor entrance into deep water. The eastern mole stretched nearly a mile into the sea. It was built of concrete and wooden pilings, designed to protect the harbor from waves, not to berth ships. The walkway on top was narrow, barely wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast. It had no bollards for mooring lines, no fenders to cushion against hulls, no gangways for loading passengers. It was, by any rational assessment, completely unsuitable for an evacuation. Tennant studied it anyway. The water alongside the mole was deep enough for destroyers. If ships could tie up there, soldiers could walk directly from shore to deck. No waiting, no small boats, no endless ferrying back and forth. It was a gamble. The mole might collapse under the weight of heavy ships bumping against it. The narrow walkway might become a death trap if the Luftwaffe attacked. But the alternative was failure. At 8 o'clock that evening, Tennant signaled Ramsay, "Please send every available craft to beaches east of Dunkirk immediately. Evacuation tomorrow night is problematical." Then he sent a more hopeful message. A personnel ship should attempt to berth at the eastern mole. It was time to test his theory. The steamer Queen of the Channel received the order. She approached the mole in darkness, her captain uncertain whether the structure would hold. Soldiers lined up along the narrow walkway, shuffling forward in the blackness, guided by the voices of Tennant's sailors. There were no gangplanks, so the crew fashioned one from mess tables. Men climbed down into the ship, cramming into every available space. By 4:15 the next morning, 950 soldiers were aboard. Queen of the Channel cast off and headed for England. She never arrived. A German bomber found her in the channel and put a bomb through her deck. She sank with most of her passengers still aboard. Other ships rescued the survivors, but the loss was devastating. Yet the mole itself had worked. Ships could berth there. Men could board quickly. The mathematics of evacuation had changed. On the 27th of May, the first full day of Operation Dynamo, 7,669 soldiers reached England. Most came from the mole, not the beaches. It was far short of what was needed, but it was a beginning. Tennant pushed his sailors harder. More ships, faster loading. Keep the lines moving. Every hour mattered now. The pressure built from every direction. On the perimeter, British and French troops fought desperate holding actions against German infantry. The Luftwaffe struck Dunkirk 12 times that day, 300 bombers dropping 15,000 high-explosive bombs and 30,000 incendiaries. They destroyed the oil tanks and wrecked what little remained of the harbor. The town became an inferno, and above the beaches, something unexpected was happening. The Royal Air Force had arrived. 16 squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes flew from bases in southern England, crossing 50 miles of open water to reach the battle zone. They had no radar coverage over France, no way to know where German formations would appear, so they flew continuous patrols, burning fuel, waiting for the enemy. When they found them, the fighting was savage. On that first day, the RAF claimed 38 kills while losing 14 of their own. German bomber commanders reported losses heavier than anything in the previous 10 days of the campaign. The Luftwaffe would not have a free hand over Dunkirk. But the soldiers on the beaches saw none of this. The dogfights happened over the horizon, out of sight. What the men saw were the bombers that got through, the Stukas that dove screaming onto their positions, the explosions that killed their comrades. They cursed the RAF for abandoning them. They did not know that pilots were dying to protect them. They knew only that bombs were falling, and no one seemed to be stopping them. On the mole, in the water, in the dunes, they waited and wondered if rescue would come in time. The 28th of May dawned gray and overcast. Low clouds hung over the channel, and smoke from burning Dunkirk drifted across the beaches like a funeral shroud. For the soldiers waiting in the dunes, the weather was a blessing. German pilots could not see their targets. The Stukas stayed on the ground. For one precious day, the evacuation could proceed without constant bombardment from above. But the news from the perimeter was catastrophic. King Leopold III of Belgium had surrendered. The Belgian army, exhausted after 18 days of fighting and desperately low on ammunition, laid down its arms. A 20-mile gap now yawned on the eastern flank of the Dunkirk pocket. German divisions that had been pinned down fighting the Belgians were free to swing north and strike the beaches. If they moved quickly, they could cut the evacuation in half. British commanders rushed troops to fill the breach. Units that had been scheduled for evacuation turned around and marched back toward the enemy. The 12th Royal Lancers, an armored car regiment, raced to Newport and found German infantry already probing forward. They stopped them there, buying hours that would translate into thousands of lives saved. All along the new line, exhausted men dug in and prepared to hold. On the beaches, a strange order emerged from chaos. Soldiers formed queues that stretched from the dunes down to the waterline and out into the sea itself. They stood in ranks, water rising to their knees, their waists, their chests, waiting for boats that might never come. British discipline held even here. Officers walked the lines, keeping men in place, preventing the panic that would doom everyone. They were queuing up as if it were a bus stop, one naval officer later recalled. It was the most British thing I have ever seen. Sergeant Bernard Kay of the Royal Engineers remembered the endless waiting. We knew the German panzers were merely waiting for first light to move in and mop us up. We were comforted to know that the Germans did not attack with tanks at night. However, the night was wearing on and time was running out. We could hear the enemy tanks on the move getting ready for the coming of dawn. Sleep was impossible. Food and water had run out days ago. Men kept their cigarettes and matches in their helmets to keep them dry while they stood in the surf. Hour after hour they shuffled forward, one place at a time, as boats came and went. Private Douglas Gough of the Royal Artillery reached the beach to find groups of soldiers simply waiting. Offshore could be seen the wrecks of several small craft and 2 or 3 larger vessels and debris lying all around. Off to my left, I saw plumes of thick black smoke and the remains of oil tanks burning. Then the aircraft came. I heard the sound of approaching aircraft. They were back again, the enemy planes flying low over us and bombing and machine gunning everybody. Everyone dived into the sand, and some began trying to dig themselves deeper into it. The little ships began arriving in force on the 29th of May. They came in every shape and size. Thames pleasure boats with names like Doris and Bluebird of Chelsea, fishing smacks from Ramsgate and Deal, motor yachts that had never ventured beyond the Thames estuary, cockle boats from Lille, open vessels barely 20 feet long. The smallest was Tamzine, a fishing boat less than 15 feet in length. She could carry perhaps half a dozen men at a time. She went anyway. Many of these vessels were crewed by Royal Navy personnel who had never handled small craft before. They grounded on sandbars, fouled their propellers on debris, lost their way in the smoke and confusion. Some were swamped by desperate soldiers who rushed them, climbing over the gunwales until the boats capsized. But others were skippered by their owners, men who knew their vessels intimately and coaxed impossible performance from them. Charles Lightoller pushed Sundowner through the chaos, filling her with soldiers until she carried 127 men in a boat designed for 10. She nearly capsized approaching Ramsgate, so low in the water that waves lapped over her deck. Every man survived. 40 miles to the south, another battle was reaching its climax. The French First Army, 40,000 strong, had been surrounded at Lille since the 28th. They were cut off from Dunkirk, cut off from hope, cut off from everything except the enemy pressing in on all sides. 7 German divisions, including 3 panzer divisions, encircled them. Erwin Rommel himself commanded part of the besieging force. The French knew they would not be evacuated. They fought anyway. General Molinier commanded the defense. His orders were simple: hold as long as possible. Every hour the French held at Lille was an hour the Germans could not attack the Dunkirk perimeter. Every division pinned down at Lille was a division not driving for the beaches. It was a sacrifice play, pure and simple, and Molinier's men knew it. They attempted 2 breakout attacks, briefly pushing the Germans back across the Duel River before being forced to withdraw. The fighting devolved into brutal house-to-house combat in the suburbs of the city. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Ammunition ran low. Food ran out entirely. For 4 days, the siege continued. French soldiers held positions they knew they could not keep, bought time they would never benefit from, died for an evacuation they would never see. On the 31st of May, with no ammunition and no hope of relief, the garrison surrendered. The Germans took prisoner 7 generals, 350 officers, and 34,600 men. But they had also lost 4 irreplaceable days. An estimated 100,000 Allied troops escaped through Dunkirk because of the French stand at Lille. German General Kurt Weger was so impressed by the defense that he granted the French the honors of war, a distinction almost never bestowed. The survivors marched into captivity with drums beating and flags flying, heads high despite their defeat. Back at Dunkirk, the evacuation was accelerating. On the 29th of May, 47,310 soldiers reached England. On the 30th, 53,823. The Eastern Mole became a conveyor belt of humanity, men shuffling down the narrow walkway in darkness, climbing down into destroyers that could hold 900 at a time. Commander James Campbell Clouston, the piermaster, organized the flow with a hat-check system. He divided waiting soldiers into groups of 50, gave each group a number, and called them forward in sequence. The men trotted along the mole at the double, their boots thundering on the concrete. Sometimes the embarkations went so smoothly that ships loaded in less than an hour. The Luftwaffe struck back whenever weather permitted. On the 29th, Stukas sank the destroyer HMS Grenade and crippled the French destroyer Mistral. Sister ships laden with 500 men, each limped away from near misses. British destroyers Jaguar and Verity were badly damaged but escaped the harbor. German bombers concentrated on the Eastern Mole, knowing its importance. Bombs blew gaps in the walkway. Sailors laid planks across the holes. Men kept moving. The 31st of May was the greatest day of the evacuation. 68,014 soldiers embarked for England. The perimeter was shrinking now, the Germans pressing closer, artillery shells falling on the beaches. But the flow of men continued. Admiral Ramsay had been awake for days. His staff officers worked in rotating shifts because he would not rest. In the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, the scale of what they were achieving began to sink in. They had expected to save 45,000. They had already saved more than 200,000. And still the ships kept coming, and still the men kept boarding, and still the miracle continued. On the 1st of June, the weather cleared. Blue skies returned to the Channel, and with them came the Luftwaffe in force. It was the most devastating day of air attacks the evacuation had yet endured. German pilots could see everything now. The long queues of men stretching into the water, the ships clustered around the mole, the little boats shuttling back and forth across the shallows. They dove on target after target with methodical precision. 4 destroyers went down that day. 27 other vessels joined them on the bottom. The sea around Dunkirk became a graveyard of broken hulls and floating debris. Commander James Campbell Clouston had been the hero of the Eastern Mole. For 5 days he had organized the evacuation with tireless efficiency, moving tens of thousands of men onto ships through his simple but effective numbering system. On the 1st of June, he returned to Dover to brief Admiral Ramsay on conditions at the beach. The next morning, he boarded an RAF motor launch to return to Dunkirk. There was still work to do. The French rearguard remained, and Clouston intended to see them safely off. 8 Stukas found his launch in the Channel. The small vessel had no chance against dive bombers. Clouston ordered the second boat in his group to continue without him, then watched as bombs tore his launch apart. He survived the initial attack but found himself in the cold water with no rescue in sight. The man who had saved so many could not save himself. He died of hypothermia before help arrived. Only one man from his launch survived. Clouston was 38 years old. That evening, the British made a difficult decision. Daylight evacuation had become too costly. Henceforth, ships would approach Dunkirk only at night. The Luftwaffe could not bomb what it could not see. This reduced the window for evacuation but dramatically cut losses. The calculus of survival was shifting hour by hour. On the 2nd of June, the last British combat troops left Dunkirk. General Harold Alexander, who had taken command after Lord Gort's departure, made a final inspection of the beaches and harbor. He and Captain Tennant cruised along the shoreline in a motor launch, calling out through a megaphone, "Is anyone there? Is anyone there?" No voices answered. The BEF was gone. At 10:50 that night, Tennant sent his famous signal to Admiral Ramsay, "BEF evacuated." 2 words that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But the evacuation was not truly over. Churchill had made a promise to the French. Britain would not abandon her ally. The Royal Navy would return for the French rearguard, the men who had held the perimeter while the British escaped. On the night of the 3rd of June, ships made the crossing once more. 26,746 soldiers, most of them French, embarked for England. On the 4th of June, another 26,175 followed. These were the last. At 2:23 in the afternoon, Operation Dynamo officially ended. The Germans raised the swastika over the docks, from which hundreds of thousands had escaped. The final accounting revealed the scale of what had been achieved and what had been lost. 338,226 Allied soldiers had been evacuated from Dunkirk. Of these, approximately 198,000 were British and 140,000 were French, Belgian, and Polish. The original plan had called for saving 45,000 men over 2 days. The actual operation lasted 9 days and rescued nearly 8 times that number. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary accomplishment. But the cost was staggering. 68,000 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured during the campaign in France and Belgium. 16,000 French soldiers died in the fighting around Dunkirk. Between 30 and 40,000 more French troops, the rearguard that had held the perimeter to the last, marched into German captivity. 90,000 Allied soldiers who had fought their way to the beaches never made it home. For every 7 men who escaped, 1 became a prisoner of war. The equipment losses defied comprehension. The BEF abandoned virtually everything it had brought to France, all of its tanks, all of its heavy artillery. 64,000 vehicles, 76,000 tons of ammunition, 20,000 motorcycles, 2,500 guns. The British Army that staggered off the ships at Dover and Ramsgate was an army in name only. The men had survived, but they had nothing left to fight with. Churchill would later joke grimly about fighting the Germans with broken beer bottles, and for a few terrible weeks, this was not far from the truth. The Royal Navy paid its own price. 240 vessels were sunk during Operation Dynamo, with another 45 damaged. 6 British destroyers and 3 French destroyers went to the bottom. The little ships suffered proportionally. Over 100 of the civilian vessels that crossed the Channel never returned. Fishermen, yacht owners, ferry captains, lifeboat crews. They sailed into a war zone, and some of them did not sail out. In the air, the RAF lost between 145 and 229 aircraft, depending on how losses were counted. At least 67 of these were Spitfires, the fighters that Britain would desperately need in the months ahead. The Luftwaffe lost somewhat more, perhaps 240 planes, but Germany could replace its losses far more easily than Britain could replace hers. The Battle of Britain was only weeks away, and every pilot, every aircraft, every hour of training would matter. Lord Gort returned to England a controversial figure. Some praised him for saving the army against impossible odds. Others blamed him for the disaster that had made evacuation necessary. Churchill protected him from the harshest criticism, recognizing that Gort's decision to retreat to Dunkirk, made against orders, had preserved Britain's ability to continue the war. Gort would never command troops in battle again, but he served with distinction as governor of Gibraltar and later Malta, where his stubborn courage proved perfectly suited to enduring siege. Admiral Ramsay emerged from the Dover tunnels, exhausted but triumphant. He had orchestrated the greatest evacuation in military history, coordinating nearly 1,000 vessels across 9 days of chaos and carnage. The king personally congratulated him. He was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. 4 years later, Ramsay would plan an even larger naval operation, the D-Day landings that returned the Allied armies to France. He did not live to see victory. On the 2nd of January 1945, his plane crashed in France, killing him instantly. He was 61 years old. Captain William Tennant, the man whose decision to use the Eastern Mole had made the evacuation possible, received the Companion of the Bath and the French Legion of Honor. His sailors nicknamed him Dunkirk Joe. He would go on to command the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, losing her to Japanese aircraft off Malaya in December 1941. Once again, Tennant found himself organizing an evacuation from a sinking vessel. Once again, he was among the last to leave. The French soldiers who had been evacuated faced a cruel irony. Most were quickly shipped back to France to continue the fight. Within weeks, France itself surrendered. The men who had escaped Dunkirk found themselves killed or captured in the final collapse. For them, the miracle had merely postponed the inevitable. Only about 3,000 of the evacuated French joined Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces in Britain. The rest vanished into German prison camps or the chaos of occupied France. On the 4th of June 1940, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons. Operation Dynamo was complete. 338,226 soldiers had escaped the beaches of Dunkirk, nearly 8 times what anyone had dared to hope. But Churchill offered no triumphalism. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory, he warned. Wars are not won by evacuations. He was right. Dunkirk was a catastrophic defeat wrapped in an astonishing rescue. The BEF lost 68,000 men and abandoned every tank, every gun, every vehicle it possessed. France would fall within weeks. Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine, defended by an army that had nothing left but rifles and courage. Yet those men lived, they trained, they waited. And 4 years later, on the 6th of June 1944, they returned to France. Many who waded off the beaches at Dunkirk waded onto the beaches at Normandy. The army that Hitler let escape came back to destroy him.